It's Monday, April 27th, and we continue our series in history. We're dealing with World War II. When we last left off, the Allies had completed D-Day. D-Day takes place June 6, 1944, and then immediately upon establishing a beachhead of France becomes the issue of logistics. How to supply an army and how to enable that army to begin to conquer. So, and by the way, that was a problem that was going to last through the entire war, is because the Germans destroyed the ports upon their departure from France. And so it was very difficult to get supplies to the front. So as things come online, General Omar Bradley sends out General Patton with his tanks, the big red one, that's his unit, and they begin heading toward the south, conquering. And as they're making their way through France, they remain so hot on the heels of the Germans that the Germans really aren't able to set up an effective defense. And so the Germans are retreating for quite some time. Now, with that in mind, we get to this point where essentially the logistics have been stretched to their limit. It really isn't possible to continue doing all these simultaneous advances across all the fronts. That was the original intent, I think, of Eisenhower and the command. And at this point, General Bernard Montgomery of Great Britain comes in and rudely, foolishly demands his way. He's trying to push through Operation Market Garden. Operation Market Garden was an attempt to cut across Belgium into Germany and to end the war early, or as he and others were claiming, to end the war by Christmas. So keep in mind, cutting across Belgium had been the German way of both World War I and World War II. But now the Allies were going to try doing it against the Germans themselves. So as I mentioned, logistics were a major problem, how to get the supplies to the people who needed it. So tanks were running out of gas, men were running out of bullets, everyone needed bazookas and heavy assault rifles, so many things. It was just hard to get them there. And Market Garden seemed like a more effective way. It would allow the port of Antwerp, it would allow closer supply lines. That's what it seemed. The Allies at this point really could only support a single advance. So even though Patton was moving well, and Patton felt, and to his credit, he was probably right, that he could have continued his advance all the way to Berlin had he been given support. Eisenhower gave Market Garden the green light. It was partially to placate the English. Bernard Montgomery took everything as a personal affront. He was an extremely rude man, not nearly as good as he believed he was. His own view of himself was much greater than the actual reality of the situation. His disrespect to a number of people, subordinates and superiors, was rather legendary. And once again, he probably wasn't worth it. There were just other men who were better at his job than he was. But he conceived of Market Garden. Market Garden had several places it could have been a great success, but it wasn't. It was a failure. There was land that was taken that had to be surrendered, especially the Netherlands. For years, Montgomery claimed that Market Garden was a success and a victory. And in the Netherlands, which were during Market Garden, they were captured by the Allies, which was good, but then the Allies had to pull back, and they were once again recaptured by the Germans, who were furious and responded by starving the Dutch. I think 20,000 people died in the famine of 44 and 45. The Dutch would often say is that Netherlands cannot survive, another one of Montgomery's successes. So the overall operation ended in failure. Thousands of Americans died. By the way, the Canadians really bore the brunt in Market Garden. They took a beating. Patton's success had been stopped as well, because while Market Garden was taking place, Patton wasn't getting the supplies he needed. So during this time, while the Allies were investing in Market Garden, they sent a large army to face Patton. They knew at some point Patton would restart, and they needed to be prepared for that. Now, ironically, this large army that met Patton, with the last of Patton's fuel, he crushed them. So while Market Garden was devolving into failure, Patton was still winning victories. This is give you an idea of what Patton was doing. This is I believe it's the M4 Sherman tank. They were small, very capable, fast, mobile, didn't have the armor or the punch of some of the bigger German tanks like the Tiger, the Panther, but still a very capable tank and served well during the war. By November 1944, the Allied line, the Western Front, was very uneven. And that's always a danger. When the line is uneven, there's always the potential of an encirclement. So it looks something like this. And when you have something like this, the Germans theoretically could come in and do what's called a pincher maneuver. And what happens is all the forces in this section right here, they can easily become overwhelmed and captured. And so the line was not stable. In some places, the Allies had made great advances. In other places, the Germans had held. In December 1944, the Germans unleashed their surprise. They had been holding for some time. Though they had been in retreat, the German High Command had gathered much of the best of their remaining units, the best men, the best equipment, and they gathered them all in one place for one final counterattack called the Battle of the Bulge. Now, right away, this is an utterly stupid and foolish thing. If the Germans were serious about surviving, they should have devoted all their forces to stopping the Soviets. Why they wanted to stop the Americans, there's no good explanation. But regardless, they launched the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The Germans reclaimed 50 miles of territory, and they surrounded the town of Bastogne, which was held by the legendary 101st Airborne and others. So there was an entire American force that was completely surrounded on all sides by the Germans. There was a famous instance here. The German commander sent the American general trapped in Bastogne a message, and the message said, "Surrender will destroy you," and the general's supposed response was nuts. And that was all his response, meaning that no garbage with that. They weren't going to mess around with that. It's like the other famous response of a Marine colonel, I believe the story goes, that's surrounded by the Japanese. The Japanese called for his surrender, and he told his men, we're surrounded by the enemy on all sides. We've got them right where we want them. And so the Americans just were not interested in the idea of surrender. At a command meeting, Eisenhower brought forth all his major generals and asked them what they were going to do to relieve the force at Bastogne. How were they going to break through and rescue these men? What Eisenhower didn't know is that before the meeting had ever been held, General Patton had already come up with a plan and had already sent off all his forces without ever asking for permission. So at this meeting, Patton says, I can rescue these men in essentially 3 days. And everyone thought that's impossible. Patton said I could do it. So they said, okay. So Patton received permission to do what he had already given orders to be done and what was already on route. So the Patton's forces broke through. They reunited with the rest of the army within 2 days, and the Battle of the Bulge was over, essentially. The Germans were broken. It was the last major push of the war for the Germans. Everything else will be trying to enact a controlled retreat. Now, on the Pacific front, in the Pacific, the Battle of the Philippine Sea took place in June 1944. It is usually not remembered as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was such an overwhelming defeat of the Japanese Navy that it is usually remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By 1944, the American forces overwhelmed the Japanese, both in quality and in quantity. The American fighters, including the Hellcat and the Corsair, were worlds better than the Japanese Zeros that they were facing. The tactics were better. The carriers outnumbered them dozens to one. It was just overwhelming strength. And there were so many Japanese airplanes that were shot down and so few American planes shot down that one of the American pilots, who I think came from the American South, he commented that this was just like back home in a big old turkey shoot. And so that name stuck, and it was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Much of the remaining carrier strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy was destroyed at the Philippine Sea. The Americans invaded and reconquered the Philippines as well, fulfilling the promise that had been made by General Douglas MacArthur of "I will return." To give you an idea of what it looked like, these are the contrails in the sky. They show all the planes as they maneuvered, many times fighters as they were looking for position to shoot down others, and these men are on deck able to watch this entire event. Next was the Battle of Leyte Gulf that took place in October. This should have been a major American defeat. Should have been. The Japanese had conceived of a brilliant fake. So the Japanese divided their forces in a number of parts, and one of the main forces, the North Force, was essentially a decoy force. When the Americans spotted the decoy force, the Japanese decoy force immediately ran. That was their plan. That was what they're supposed to do. Admiral Halsey at this moment was covering the landing of thousands and thousands of American soldiers on the beaches. Now, during a landing, all the ships that are participating in the landing are helpless. It is crucial that they are protected. Admiral William Halsey, Bill Halsey, nickname was Bull Halsey. Admiral Halsey was usually an excellent admiral, a genius at what he did, but he made a crucial mistake. He took almost all of his fighting forces and went and pursued the Japanese fleet, thinking this is the only Japanese fighting force. If I sink them, then the entire Japanese Navy will be crushed. But this was just a decoy force. He left behind a group of small carrier forces called Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Now, in the United States, there were two kinds of aircraft carriers. There were fleet carriers, and let's just say that they were this long, and there were escort carriers, and escort carriers were this long. They were much smaller. They were primarily used for convoy duty and for ferrying aircraft. They weren't meant to take the brunt of a real fleet action. So Halsey took the main force and he sailed away, left behind three little groups of little aircraft carriers called Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Amazingly, the Japanese force came up the channel, and the Americans, rather than retreating, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, they launched everything they had. Little destroyer escorts, which were even smaller than destroyers, they're just tiny ships, they charged in to face battleships. All airplanes were launched. Everything, smoke screens, torpedoes, everything the Americans had, they launched. And every American sailor that went in knowing that they had no chance. This should have been a slaughter. But the Americans fought with such tenacity. They fought to the absolute bitter end that the Japanese were convinced this must be only part of a much larger force. And so even though the American forces took a fearful beating, thousands, hundreds, at least hundreds died, and maybe into the thousands, many ships were sunk, the Japanese main force turned around convinced that Halsey hadn't bitten on the fake, that this was the real force. And so Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3 held the line. They saved every man on the beach. They saved the ships. Halsey was in serious trouble for what he did, but eventually everything worked out. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was also the first time the Japanese used kamikaze raids. Kamikaze were similar to the banzai charge. Rather than trying to drop the bombs, the airplanes became the bombs, which meant that you could steer them all the way into the ship. And these were highly loaded planes filled with explosives and fuel, and they caused tremendous damage, killed many men. And also, it was a suicide mission. All the pilots who flew kamikaze missions, they were intended to die. As 1944-45 began, it was obvious the war was going to be won by the Allies. The only question at this point remained how many people were going to need to die. So the leaders of both Germany and Japan, they wanted their nations to die. They wanted everyone to die. They wanted, in Germany, Hitler was calling on the German people to essentially commit suicide rather than lose to the Allies. In Japan was spreading the myth that the Americans would torture them and mistreat them, so they might as well fight to the death. Now, there was a reason the Japanese were saying this. It's because the Japanese had, ever since 1935 in China, been torturing and mistreating their own prisoners. So when they told the rest of their soldiers that you will be tortured and mistreated, the Japanese soldiers thought that, of course, makes sense because we torture and we mistreat. But the truth was the Japanese were unique. The few Japanese prisoners that were taken were largely, they were held in prisoner of war camps and treated fairly. But that was not the case with Americans and Australians and British and Canadians and others who were captured by the Japanese. But Germany had a different reason, though, an additional reason, not just the humiliation that they wanted to avoid. For years, Hitler and the German nation had discussed what they called the Jewish question. The Germans, ever since Hitler came to power, really since 33 and 34, had been rounding up Jews and Gypsies, homosexuals, the handicapped, and other ethnic minorities, and sending them to concentration camps. And there, these people were enslaved, tortured, and murdered. And this was one of the most evil things of the 20th century, on par with the Soviet Union and their massacre of their own people, and the Chinese Communists and their own massacres of their own people. Um, the Holocaust is this suffering, primarily of Jews, but also of these other groups, that they endured at the hands of the Germans. It was an industrial system, and what I mean by that is it was like a factory. It wasn't just a few bad people doing bad things. This was an entire commitment, an entire force, an entire command was devoted to this. After the war, almost everyone in Germany pretended they had nothing to do with it and they didn't know about it, and that's a lie. Um, it's just is. More than 6 million people were killed, many Jews. As the American troops entered German territory, they began to discover these camps, and it was an utter shock and an abomination to the Americans and to the Canadians and the British when they found these things. General Eisenhower, when notified of this new discovery of a camp filled with people that are near death, that were living skeletons, he personally visited one of the first camps. He investigated every part, and he ordered that everything would be documented and photographed because he knew in the years ahead people would deny that this ever took place. And he wanted to be a witness, and he wanted to make sure there was ample evidence. And so Eisenhower oversaw a documentation of all the evil that the Germans had done. He also made local Germans, the towns nearby these camps, whether Auschwitz or Treblinka or other places, who intentionally refused to acknowledge the atrocities, go to the camp and clean them up and bury the bodies. Some of these people later committed suicide when they saw that they had ignored this intentionally. Germany itself was dissolving as a nation. The Soviets were invading from the east, and the Americans and British were from the west. The German army and the German people were surrendering en masse in 1945. There was no question of who was going to win. The only question was, who would you surrender to? And many German soldiers and German people wisely realized that if you wanted to be captured, it was much better to be captured by the Americans than by the Soviets. In the East, German soldiers were being shot as soon as they surrendered, and the German people were being beaten and raped and murdered by the Soviet army. Keep in mind, the Soviets had experienced, when the Germans invaded, beatings and murders and rape. And so when the Soviets came back and the Russians invaded Germany, they did the same thing, beatings and murders and rape. And so there was a sincere desire on the part of many to try to get as far west as possible and be captured by the Americans. To be captured by the Americans, by the British, by the Canadians, by the Australians, just by the Allies on the west, meant that you would be protected and you would have hope. So we'll pick up tomorrow as we get into 1945 and the final days of World War II.